So, hi everybody. Welcome to Queer Kinship Networks. That is a panel inside this beautiful, important meeting, Queer Kinship, Affects, Families, Bond. My name is Tiziana De Rogatis. I am the chair of this panel. And I am the chair of this panel because I am a colleague and a friend of Silvia Antosa, one of the organizers, together with Charlotte Ross and Paolo Frasca, to whom the University of Foreigners Siena, which I belong, express all the gratitude. And I'm here also because I am the president and a member of the committee of the University of Foreigners of Siena for equal opportunity and against discrimination. So for me, is a very important moment. This panel is called Queer Kinship Networks and has two contributions from Marta Cariello and Diletta Pasetti. I'm going to introduce now the short bio of the two speakers, and then I will give the floor to Marta Cariello. Marta Cariello is Associate Professor in English Literature and Cultural Studies at Università della Campania Luigi Vanvitelli in Naples, Italy. She established on post-colonial literature with a specific focus on Anglophone Arab women writers on the Mediterranean as a critical space of modernity and more broadly on cultural studies. Among her recent publications, La Questione Mediterranea with Ian Chambers, very important scholar, Mondadori 2019, and the Italian translation of Natalie Handel's The Leaves of Rain, Jacobelli, 2018. She is founder, co-director of the academic journal De Genere, which is a very important journal of literary, postcolonial, and gender studies. Her current research focuses on intersection of narratives of race, nationhood, and citizenship. And the second speaker is Diletta Pasetti. She's a second-year PhD student in the Italian department at Rutgers University. Her previous work focused on Leopardi's circular writing and Father's Mazzolari prophetic social visions. Currently, she happily teaches Italian at Rutgers. While investigating feminist and queer theory, multi-species studies, and contemporary Italian literature. Her current research focuses on data femicide and media rhetoric, Alda Merini's memoirs, and Primo Mazzolari's work in translation. I'm going now to welcome the first speaker, Marta Cariello. The title of her talk will be Good Evening, Hello. No, that's beautiful. That's Alliance with the audiences. Okay, the title of our talk will be explained by Marta Cariello herself. And okay, on believing, belonging, I don't know why in the paper was on believing, belonging, and birds, Zain Yukadar's 30 Names of Night.
Thank you very much. Il programma c'era quest'anno. Era quello di Magia Vicana. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Tiziana, very much for your generous words. So what I'm going to do today is propose a reading of Syrian-American author Zain Yukadar's novel, The 30 Names of Night, which was published in 2021. And it is a reflection on community and kin and family. It's also a very complex and very good book, I have to say. And I say this because I'm not going to do justice to the complexity of the novel. But what I find particularly interesting in this context is how this work puts forth the relationship, I think, between community, belonging, kinship, and history and the past, and how we narrate the past. And so This book interlinks kin-making, community building in the queer community with the experience of the immigrant community or immigrant community building. And this is not to conflate the two experiences and flatten them into a common undistinguishable ground, or what Meg Wesling discusses as the queer diasporic subject, and I quote, who is called upon to bear witness to the political, material, familial, and intellectual transformations of globalization. In other words, some mobile subject apparently unhinged from the material conditions of globalization. And of course, this would in itself, constitute a whole paper. But just, I think it's interesting to think about this category of the queer diasporic subject and what is projected onto it, etc. And I do agree that the material conditions of globalization still do play a fundamental part in the discourse, both on the diasporic subject and the queer subject. However, what I'm particularly interested in here is perhaps we could say moving from space to time. So looking at the relationship with time, though the two are not really separable, and that is true. Anyway, time and narrative. So going back to the book, I think Jochedar's novel offers really an aesthetic and ethical, I would say, interpolation through the act of narrating about what narrative means, what narration means, for finding roots and linkages, where kin-making involves being willing to see and hear what is not told or not spoken or written. And the experience and existence of communities erased from the narrative is intimately tied to their recognition in the archives of history, in memory, and hegemonic narratives. So in the 30 Names of Night, the past opens up, like Earth, to the entanglements of stories, histories, erased identities that run through this community that populates the book, a community of Syrian American queer extended family. And the novel is set in present-day New York City with an unusual material connection to the city and its matter, like materially connected to the city. It tells the story of a young transgender man, part of the Syrian community in New York, and I've been using this word community a lot, but it's really a transformative term throughout the novel. And this is a New York City that is unexplainably invaded by birds. Birds of all species, rare, common for the area. The entire book is actually inhabited by birds, and I'll get back to the birds and the significance that I have traced to them. So the young man's story is interwoven with that of a Syrian artist who, in the book, also had immigrated to the US, but in the 1930s, and her name was Layla Z, who was well known in the Syrian community especially, and had disappeared decades before the boy was born. And so immediately there's different genres within this novel. There's even a detective story in a way, and as we'll see, there's a ghost story and other levels as well. The boy, the young man, it's also a little bit of a coming of age story. So the boy is nameless throughout most of the novel until he comes out to his family and loved ones and chooses his name. And he chooses Nadir, which in Arabic means rare, precious, or rare. So that obviously has a highly symbolic meaning. And Nadir finds Layla Z's diary in an abandoned community building that is used to house the Syrian community and their social activities. So again, highly symbolic community house, which, by the way, actually did exist in Manhattan. So that's also interesting. And the artist Laila Z used to also live there in the fictional story. And Nadir uncovers connections and links that he had no idea of, not only in the interweaving stories of Laila and his family, but also a deeper belonging and kinship with his own family. He discovers a lot of untold stories about his own family. And it leads him to a recognition, a seeing himself in history and in this history and community. He sees the people that populate it, and he learns in the process something about faith, and I'll get back to this. So the two parallel storylines are both told in the second person, respectively, Nadir speaking to his mother, who had died actually a few years prior, and whose ghostly presence is a constant until the final resolution. So there is definitely the element of a ghost story. Nader sees her and also interacts with her to a certain degree. And then Laila, who also writes, she writes a journal, the journal that Nader finds, and it is all in the second person, and it is addressed to her first impossible love, which will turn out to be someone very close to Nader. So, as I mentioned, the question of community and kin and family is present throughout the novel. Again, the community house is a symbolic place where Nader finds Laila's notebook. This is a place that his mother had advocated to be protected against gentrification and demolition in Manhattan. It is the place that will hold the key to this mystery that runs throughout the novel of a missing piece of art by the artist Laila Z. And it also holds the key, again, symbolically, to the missing piece or pieces of Nader's belonging. In the city, New York City holds memory in ways that are rarely seen in what is normally considered new or anyway recent US urbanization compared to Europe, for example. And yet the protagonist searches for and finds the vibrations of pre-colonial inhabitants in that land, of migrant communities passing through for periods of time of slavery and subalternity and violence, consumed in those streets and at those concrete foundations. So speaking of his mother's activism in defense of the community house, for example, Nader ponders, so I'm not sure how, there we go, okay. All right, so Nader ponders, and I quote, "Some people go their whole lives in New York, shutting their eyes to the fact that this city was built for the people who took this land from the Lenape. Sometimes I wonder why you never spoke of this." He's speaking to his mother. "Maybe you thought I was too young to understand, or you were just desperate to eke out an existence here. Now I am old enough to understand that we live on land that remembers. I hear the voices when I touch the brick or pavement, catch fragments of words exchanged hundreds of years before the island of Mannahatta was paved. I sometimes think about the Arabs and other immigrants who came here a century before my own family, hoping they wouldn't be devoured by the bottomless hunger of the very forces that drove them from their homelands, hoping they could survive in this place that was not built for them." So here, Shahadar introduces, at the beginning of the novel, the memory of the land, right? We live on a land that remembers, of what was there and still echoes to his ears, and at the same time, the memory and the present of the immigrants, of those communities that have crossed and still cross lands and seas, by the way, like migratory birds. There are some scenes in the novel where actually birds do follow the ships of migrants crossing to build better lives for themselves. The echo of unexpected pasts is for Nader the intersection of his immigrant family and the queer relations woven through it. It is unregistered stories and histories in this very specific intersection. One of the genres within this novel, as I said, is the ghost story or ghost novel. And Nadir's mother is not the only spectral presence. The past is there as a ghost throughout the text. But I also think that it's there, yes, as a spectral presence, but it's also essential. Like Nadir's mother, it's essential as a present key to building the belonging that traverses as a necessity the entire novel. So the invitation, and that's the main point I'm trying to make, is to rework the linearity of the narrative, of history, of Nadir's, of our relationship with the past, which is a relationship of teleological instrumentality in the story and history of Western progress, and a strictly written culture, right? Whether the monotheistic ones or the forms or those that form and inform our relationship with the past, with history and the truth in terms of certifiability, right? Instead, what Jogadar proposes is that the unbelievable or the uncertified or perhaps uncertifiable other communities, other cultures, other ways of being together pan out other rhythms. In the intersection of queer diaspora, there is not only disruptive mobility, again, as I said in the beginning, in space and in identity, but I also think that it's this disruption in a different articulation of time and history. So timelines are confused, as is the realism in the novel, which it becomes magical at times. But also politically clear, very clear in its statements at other times. So Nadir's grandmother, for example, at one point states that not everything must be spoken to be real. When she tells many stories, but not everything must be spoken to be real. And later, Nadir considers tales, stories, and authority in relation to his mother's study of birds. For example, these are just a few examples. He says, but you know how slippery a story can be. The tale of the birds might have come from a distant uncle or a great-great-grandmother rather than a 13th century Persian astronomer, but that doesn't make the story less true. Jogadar builds the two parallel accounts, not only linked by the until then unknown relations that had existed between Layla and Nadir's family, but also by the continuous negotiations, again, with belonging to a land, to a people, and also to oneself. And I would add, actually, to one's body. Nadir thinks about the space he inhabits there in the city of New York, in the US, in his community, but also within his body, the body that he inhabits. And so, for example, he reflects in many different points of the story, but here, for example, he says, I am tired, I am bleeding again, my body feels heavy and bloated, my chest so sore that I want to rip off my binder and feel the night air on my skin. So there is not only space, but also a body that is unfamiliar in this case. And blood is also a theme that runs through the novel, menstrual blood, and also blood in terms of blood ties and genealogies and, again, family. So the work of belonging and unbelonging is really articulated in its complexities. And thinking about his mother's funeral, again, he speaks to her. She says, we buried not a person, he says, sorry, Nadir says, we buried not a person, but a continent that day. We're made from clay after all, aren't we? And underground springs of threads of copper run through in our veins. When this country asks me where I'm from, they aren't asking for the city and my birth certificate, but whose earth is in my blood. In the course of the novel, Nadir finds kinship in a queer, multicultural community, a welcoming, liberating family, while also renegotiating his bonds with his biological family, wherein, for example, his grandmother is revealed then to have been Layla's first love back in Syria. and his aunt is in love with a woman who lives in their building in Brooklyn. So again, the past and history reveal so much more recognition also. And if you are able to see or believe, like Nadia's grandmother said, she says, not everything must be spoken to be real. Or we could say that the erasures of official narratives do not erase non-hegemonic kinships and communities. One must, however, must be able or willing to see or believe. Like Nadia's mother, who before her, Laila Z, were able to see and believe in the existence of an extremely rare bird that almost no one was willing to credit them for. And so now I come to the birds, and I have notes in my notebook that says birds, you know. And there's some obvious and clear symbolic meanings attached to the birds, but exploring this question of the relationship with time and history, I kept, you know, sort of asking myself, what do birds have to do with time and the past? They symbolize community, clearly. They appear in flocks. There's nests. There's even a crow's funeral at one point, so with crows attending the funeral. But what are they telling us about time and about the past? They are fleeting, so they come and they go, and so you see them and then you don't see them. They also mark in the book, and not only in the book, obviously, time periods through migration, so that's also an element. And perhaps even more so, they have always been symbolically tied to divination, so bringing messages, if you will, about the future. In the book, they are both omens of bad things, but also they also bring good luck. So they span over all of these elements. And there is also then the element of rarity, this rare bird, right, that Nadia's mother insisted that she saw. She had become an ornithologist, though not trained as one. And Laila Z had painted this bird. And also there's one African-American ornithologist who also, at the time of Laila Z, recognized the existence of this bird. But nobody else in the scientific community believed them. So this rare bird was in the past. Not only did the process of recognition of this bird entail the women's faith in what they had seen, against the skepticism, right, of the scientific community, but it also brings Nader himself into his own quest, into a completely personal form of faith. And also, actually, the reader is brought into this form of trust and faith in the process, allowing him to see and be seen and find kinship. The element that links community and history, which I found to be the key in my reading of this book, as I said, again, is the willingness then to see what is not written, to hear what is not told, etc. And in this sense, the rare birds, which no one believes existed, except again, Laila Z, this one ornithologist and Nadia's mother, embodies that which we see if we have faith in the unnamed, the unspoken, the unbelievable even. And this is the ethical and aesthetic offering that this book makes. Do we want to see the connections that are erased? And it may seem simple or even obvious, but the question put in terms of faith builds a sacredness unto the unnamed, the unbelieved, that is, I think, the stuff of kin, the linkages that have no institutional seal, the archives that have no archons, the echoes that reverberate in brick walls, oral narratives, community houses, and unwritten families. And Laila Z had, we discover, her own queer family at a time she didn't have a name for it. And this, along with many others, is one of the interweavings, right, of Nadia's lifeline. Finding kin in his past, Laila's connection to his grandmother, for example, in his present, through the queer and immigrant community that he finds and builds around him. And I'm almost concluding through the teachings of that immigrant community, emerging in the narratives and in stories of solidarity, mutual healing, bonds in difficult times, and bonds in the memory of the common land left behind as well. Nader also comes to find intimacy and love in the end, and I've spoiled a lot of the novel, but I have to. But there's lots more. And he too sees what is uncertified. So he says something could be built here, I think, something resembling a family. If an object can become sacred by placing it on a table and calling it an altar, then who is to say we cannot sanctify our own bodies? Thank you. I don't know how much time I took, but
Perhaps I'm assuming why he left. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marta, for these extraordinary papers. So interesting. I'm going to read this novel, and I had a look, and it doesn't look like it's translated in Italian.
No,
No, just the first book of Zen Jukadar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just read.
Sì, volevo spellere. Ah sì, ok, interrompi.
E poi aprire la presentazione nuova.
Sì, aspetta, voglio staccare la chiavetta di Marta, sempre per la questione dell'umanità verso la chiavetta. So I was, while Diletta is preparing the new material, I'm just trying to highlight some points. The element was much striking to me is the spectral, the ghost element of the birds is really a Derridian imagery and very connected to traumas. It's so interesting.
There's so many levels, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So just
We might just need to access that space to get the presentation.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, it's very little.
Just a little
space.
technical issue.
And we will just have a discussion after. Just wanted to say something in order to synthesize. Thank you.
No,
That's very important.
Yeah, but that's not the
Right. I didn't open that one.
Of course, no, of course.
It's totally
It's
there.
That was
It's totally there. I can perceive it.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
It's spectral.
And then we go to.
No, immediately.
Again,
But the
Sue.
second
That should be-
slide
that
was
should be-
evident, was striking.
Yeah, if we go
for
back
me.
into Zoom.
Yeah. And also, it's
click on here,
midday
and then
because
what we
it's
need is
using-
continuous.
I had a look,
Coming up.
Midday.
Yeah.
It's more like a translingual writer.
He was only English, but.
I mean, the mother.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, sorry, it was my.
Do the whole screen.
Yeah.
I think it's this one here.
Yeah,
That one, because
Yeah.
modalità.
Oh, yeah, perfect.
But sure. At least.
Could be, it could be. Please.
So, good morning, everyone. Buongiorno a tutti. And first of all, I want to thank you, the organizer, for this amazing conference, because yesterday all the panels were incredible, and I'm very happy to be here. So, etymology never lies. Usually, it works as a sentinel to bring us back to the word's raw meaning, still untouched by interpretations that have distorted its nature. The roots of surrogacy already suggest an alternative interpretation of its value that is not related to its trading connotation. Subrogare can be translated as rather than moving in a straight line, since rogare seemingly comes from the Proto-Indian European root of reg, to move in a straight line, and the suffix sub meaning in the place of. So instead of moving along the bloodline paradigm, surrogacy maternity, or more appropriately, gestational surrogacy, exceeds the traditional borders of family and generates a rhizomatic kinship that still represents a controversial issue when not a taboo. With this biological, emotional, and legal entanglements, it proposes an approach to parenthood that is anything but straight. In her posthumous book Dare la Vita, curated by Alessandro Giammei, Michela Murgia draws some reflections on what being queer means and on divergent experiences of pregnancy, from abortion to pregnancy for others, questioning the logic of the ethical fundamentals behind their normative regulation and opening to alternative, more inclusive ways on imagining and embracing practices of motherhood and kinship. A brave publication that would have brought another wave of social and media hatred to its author if she were still physically present, has happened so many times in the past when Murgia used her body and her voice to make the stand that politics wouldn't risk entertaining. And I say physically present because her voice is still very present and will continue to make a lot of noise. In a country where the Prime Minister calls for punishing surrogacy as a universal crime, while remembering the Catholic roots of Italian culture and praising the traditional family, talking about queer motherhood is like talking about something unnatural, sinful, and obscure. So why is it socially burdensome to recognize a new threshold for alternative form of becoming mothers, while at the same time, it is blindly accepted that 2,000 years ago, impregnated by the Holy Spirit and outside the marital relation, an ordinary woman gave birth to the child of God? Through a close reading of Murgia's text, Dare la Vita and Ave Mary, and philosophical and sociological analysis of the concept of maternity and pregnancy, this paper will try to investigate how the paradigm of the Virgin has shaped the idea of motherhood and the consequent resistance to a new interpretation of it, while actually representing what can be considered as the first case of pregnancy for others. But let's begin with the basics. I am not ashamed, or maybe a little, to say that reading Dare la Vita has been a practice of disclosing a not so evident, very self-evident truth. Being pregnant and being a mother are two very different stories. And blood is two very different stories. Being pregnant and being a mother are two very different stories. And blood is weaponized to incorporate them into an overlapping controlled narration. Will and choice represented what the anticoagulant that feminist movement had used in the past decades to tear them apart and then keep these biological and relational realities separated. From Beauvoir's rejection of biology as destiny to Lonzi's liberating distinction between clitoral and vaginal woman, the understanding of maternity has been profoundly recast in the last century, thanks to the tenacious work of feminist movements. The precious separation between pregnancy and maternity, on which Murgia also shed light, embodies a line that patriarchal and oppressive discourses constantly fight to blur, with the aim to keep this difference unseen, retagging and caging individual choices under the label of natural predestination. However, feminist and queer movement, at least in Italy, always had to operate in the shadow of another cumbersome, contradictory, and probably therefore extremely attractive paradigm, that of the Virgin Mary. While her story represents de facto a very non-conventional pregnancy, let alone the maternity, being an ordinary woman and the mother of God, the Virgin's tale had been exploited and imposed as the traditional motherhood scheme par excellence. So how does this twisting representation occur? Power discourses never get old. And neither did they start to manifest with Foucault's formulation of them. And yes, the end of patriarchy is behind the rewriting of one of the most revolutionary female stories into one with more subdued tones. The Catholic Church revision of the Virgin tale started from the very origin. A labor lime that, through the centuries, transfigured a conscious consent to maternity into an obedient, almost inevitable acceptance of a destiny of pregnancy. Murja's essay, Ave Mary, helps in the reconstruction of the reasons and intentions behind this epistemological twist. Contemporary reception of the tale denounces a dangerous amnesia in regards to Mary's agency, leaving out the gargantuan detail that the protagonist of this story is a teenager, promised to a man, not married, called to justify a pregnancy generated outside of the marriage, and, if that wasn't enough, to claim that it is God's will. As Murja writes, Mary's yes was a suicide in the land of man. But Mary did only what she wanted, by her own terms, to her own conditions, forcing all the system she was in to bend at their freedom to say yes. Not exactly a straight, safe model of obedience for women. So the character must be revised. A new Marian truth has been told and repeated by male voices until the disruptiveness of her challenging the status quo yes turned into a modest appeasement to a greater power, the power of God, the Father, over all the mothers, heavenly and mundane ones. The re-narration of the virgin tale gives birth to a patriarchal paradigm of motherhood where women can only be passive subjects, natural dispensers of care and dedication to the other, a feature majestically celebrated in the Catholic tradition also by the figure of Mother Teresa. The femminilità di servizio, a femininity of service that, in Murja's words, in the dedication to the others, realizes the nullification of itself. Through the Marian ideal, Catholicism places maternity as the supreme marker of fulfilled femininity, as Murja states in Dare Vita. It is not by chance that for many decades, the act of beatification of women was related to their maternal function and not to their social or political actions, as it happened with men. The Virgin Mother underwent a process of purification that established, and I quote from Murja, an angelic aesthetic model of Mary, which had torn the girl of Israel from the aspirational world of normal women, making her untranslatable and unattainable. It transformed maternity into an oblative, pure joy, an idyllic representation in front of which, as Murja magnificently epitomizes, one either kneels or curses. Mary's perfection embodies a divine motherhood impossible to reach because it has been deprived of the natural, unfathomable side of the biological element. Pregnancy, in fact, does not find any space in the virgin tale because the gestional act condenses the terrible, il tremendo, as Elena Ferrante defines it in Frantumaglia. This kind of mystery shares no relation with the magic of the divine. On the contrary, it ends up representing its antipode. The biological tremendo speaks the same mother tongue as the bestial. It has a visceral relationship with the animality that women share with non-human animals. The dark side of the womb is the shared genetic heritage of what Cavarero defines as the terrible universal nature. In her last book, Donne che allattano cuccioli di lupo, Women that Nurse Wolf Cubs. Accepting the pregnancy's natural obscurity means eclipsing the splendid purity of the divine element of maternity. A reception that could be conceivable for a philosophical approach that shifts its focus from the anthropocentric delusion of grandeur, but unthinkable for a religious system generated and founded on masculine nomos. In representing motherhood as a social role, Catholic Church narration has absorbed the dark mystery of pregnancy and erased it. The absolute brightness of the Virgin's happy motherhood blinds whoever look at this model, hiding the obscure side of pregnancy and continuously recasting what should finally be the free choice of maternity into the always hunting social destiny for all female human animals. This is precisely why, in my opinion, surrogacy represents a political threat to this paranormal archetype of motherhood. Its ontological truth constitutes not only a resumption of the biological element as a fundamental step of pregnancy, but also a sublimation of it into a relational trait while remaining outside the bloodline. Gestational surrogacy outpaces both biological and spiritual elitism, using science as a tool to transform biology from destiny into an expression of individual desire and relational choice, expanding the possibilities of creating kinship beyond blood, the odds, and normative structures. It realizes as marginatura, to use Ferrante's word. It exceeds the margins between pregnancy and maternity, not by overlapping them, as the Marian tale was built to do, but by creating a new threshold where alternative and conscious ways of being mothers could be imaginated. This more than natural form of pregnancy appears as the labor that delivers unpredictable kinship paradigms and breaks the oppressive framework of, and I quote, the work of making other bodies that Donna Haraway indicates in Cyber Manifesto through the transfer of choice. It opens to other paths of becoming relatives, to imagine possibility of non-normative relations. Surrogacy removed maternity from the axis of patriarchal values and reinserted it in a rhizomatic system of creation, in the multidirectionality available only in the chosen kinships, beyond the taxonomic linearity of science and the controlling practice of male-manipulated religious principle. To quote Haraway, it makes babies while making kin. By freeing maternity from within, it places the biological at the service of the relational, and not vice versa, generating a new solution that maybe could have convinced Beauvoir, since it synchronously flips the social construct too. It also redeems the essential revolutionary of the yes pronounced by the Virgin Mary, because in surrogacy pregnancy, women's individual intentions and desires return to be pivotal in the experience of maternity. It is this crack in the traditional century-lasting reception of motherhood divine archetype that makes the seed of social conservative terror sprout. The possibility for women to dispose of their bodies, to generate without becoming mother, or to be mothers without having generated, is, in my opinion, what brought Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to call for a political headline on the practice of pregnancy for others, adding to the politics of disgust that already damage non-heteronormative subjects. The arguments used to construct this act of love simply do not add when read with respect to the sacred family portrayal or the Catholic values. One of the main accusations to surrogacy, and therefore to queer families, results in them being not normal or natural. But how does the story of Joseph and Mary mirror the traditional family prototype that conservative parties want to impose? Joseph agreed to raise a child born somehow outside of the marriage, to believe in an uncanny story about the Holy Spirit and God's will, and not to touch his spouse. Also, Mary had to become retroactively special to justify her elevation to Queen of Heaven. As Mary Robin writes in Mother of God, Mary's natural humanity required an extra, and I quote, infusion of grace to make her worthy of the motherhood of Christ, unquote. The formulation of the Immaculate Conception implicitly admits that Mary herself came from a different form of conception. Paradoxically, or ironically enough, this extraterrestrial purity has long been considered an act of heresy. The sacred family model appears more like a prototype of queer kinship rather than the normative version that had been imposed, in which the other, for whom the pregnancy takes place, is God. The question regarding the life quality of babies born from different biological parents stands as one of the lines used by pro-life and pro-family activists to judge and critique those who explore alternative modalities to generate parenthood. As Mudger recognizes in Dare la Vita, usually nobody actually gives a damn about what little boys and girls think. Children's interests turn into political and moral battlefields used to hide a potent fear of alternative rebel way of building, creating families and kinships. Of course, rules have to be set to prevent women who decide to embark on this adventure from being abused in this jungle of economic exploitation, thus transforming them into, and I quote, empty vessels with no rights or protections, and Yasmin Hergas denounces in Reassembling Motherhood. Laws and regulation are very much needed also to protect the children born through this procedure from being merely intended as bioengineering products to be bought or returned. It is essential to shed light on these controversial issues too when confronting pregnancy for others. To be free to visualize and realize these alternative forms of kinship, society needs laws to readjust the practice to its semiotic, guaranteeing reproductive justice and enlarging the relational generosity. There is a weird power in maternity, writes Virginia Woolf. Surrogacy builds one of the infinite paths to realize the weirdness, a threshold to explore the queerness of relationships that exceed the biological and the logical. It embraces the terrible of the natural and accompanies it among its contradictions and complexities, transforming the weird in queered, offering a space of co-becoming that acts beyond the genealogical lines. Do we really need godless mothers, asked Cavarero when portraying the phenomenon of the hypermatern in their literary and mythologic narratives? I guess the answer is no. Relation is revolution, as our guest speaker Nicoletta Valorani said yesterday. We do not need queening motherhood. We long for queered relations that challenge the predominant narrative, creating space for exponential kinship. Thank you.